Portland, 60 miles downstream from Salem, where rivers, people, and new ideas come together. Portland punches well above its weight when it comes to progressive urbanism. It was here, in 1974, that Portland became the first city to intentionally remove a highway, which is now the iconic Tom McCall Waterfront Park. Portland was on a very different trajectory when Tom McCall was elected governor in 1966. Highways were still going up left and right, and Portland suburbs were sprawling from one side of the valley to the other. In his words,
the unfettered despoiling of our land, sagebrush subdivisions, coastal condominium, and the ravenous rampage of suburbia here in the Willamette Valley all threaten to mark Oregon's status as the environmental model of this nation.
McCall's administration is responsible for the majority of the land use laws we still use today, including the urban growth boundary. Oregon was the first state to implement statewide urban growth boundaries for all of its cities. This meant cities and metropolitan areas couldn't sprawl outward unless they demonstrated that they had a good reason to do so. With Henry Richmond, Tom McCall co-founded the nonprofit 1000 Friends of Oregon to hold our cities accountable and challenge cities who tried to pave over our fields and forests for no good reason. Demand for housing in Portland has grown and grown, so in the past decades, Portland has tried to prevent the spillover of housing outside the urban growth boundary by building up and filling in rather than sprawling. In the early 2000s, Interstate Avenue welcomed the Max Yellow Line, and since then, the corridor has evolved into one of North Portland's most active and productive streets.
Yeah, the Interstate Avenue corridor, was a major connector north-south, including from downtown Portland into Vancouver, Washington. So it was a major link. And before the construction of the I-5 freeway, it was really the principal route for traffic along that way. And so in the 40s and 50s, you would see a lot of motels built there. And so, and many of them had very large and playful neon signs. And so the district was a whole combination of things, courtyard apartments, schools, parks, but there were a lot of missing teeth in the corridor. And once the I-5 freeway went in, it just seemed to the city, going back as far as the 1993 Albina plan, that this area was ripe for infill development. But what needed to occur to make that possible was the construction of the light rail line there. And its first objective, the light rail line, was to connect central Portland with the Expo Center at the far north end near Kenton. And so once that investment, a decade or so, well, more than that, almost 2 decades later, was put into place and constructed, it was time to kind of swing back and look at the potential for development in the district that would keep much of the neighborhood character adjoining the corridor, and in some cases on the corridor itself, with the ability to infill in a more dense pattern. And so that was really the objective there. There were just, as I say, a lot of missing teeth, and by that I mean vacant lots or very underutilized lots. And some uses like light manufacturing or repair and those kinds of things were also present on the corridor. And some of those have kept, and they are allowed to be kept under the zoning. So we took an approach then that said, here's a great potential for infill housing for the most part, and to some extent commercial development as well, along the light rail corridor. And we went at least a block deep from the corridor itself, and then made some minor adjustments in the adjoining lower density residential areas to that corridor. And we wanted to take a design approach so that we kept the notion of good transitions between high and low density, that we encouraged active storefront retail along the corridor itself, and then that we allowed a sort of a a graduated height, nodal height, if you might say, right at the station. So there are about 5 stations plus the Kenton would make 6. And so it really was important to kind of signify that those are high traffic areas with the light rail stop. So that was sort of our approach, general approach to it. And one thing that occurred then, and I think it was an important precedent, is that that whole process from beginning to end took about 15 months, 16 months, and with a lot of public engagement. And so that's something that I think we really had our eye on, to not let this drag out for 3 or 4 years, but to do both the robust public engagement, the careful design look, and the writing of regulations all within that period. And so we were just anxious to see it happen. And I think it's, fairly shortly after the plan was adopted, we started to see new developments proposed along that, partially helped by 10-year tax abatements for the residential pieces. And it happened actually pretty quickly. So I think it became very instructive for us as we approached other neighborhood rezonings throughout the city. And it's revitalized, I believe, there's a new grocery since then. There is much more street-oriented commercial. Some of the buildings are residential all the way down to the street, and some are a mix that have retail ground floors. And so it's really kind of activated the area. And I think ridership is up on the line. And something we had hoped for but not fully anticipated was the level of bicycle traffic, of people commuting cross corridor, get to Mississippi, or even to get downtown, or to get further north on the corridor. There's a lot of bicycle usage now, which is amenable because we designated bike streets, and we designated we had wider sidewalks everywhere and that kind of thing. So I think in that regard, it's been a successful infill strategy. Most of the developers, as far as I know, and it have been many years since now, are local, many of them Portland based and certainly Northwest based. So this is not a place that it was on the radar screen or maybe attractive for the huge large scale national housing developers that frankly mostly concentrate in suburban and greenfield development, where they can get huge tracts of land and do 2,000 units at a whack. So this was really meant to be careful, thoughtful infill. And so
Yeah.
whole different kind of developer, a local.
Yeah. So like, not only does that probably represent local character better, but then it also keeps money in the economy.
Correct.
Yeah. And as the local developers get more experience, get more skills and wealth, they can do more projects like this and really
they take on more.
get the ball rolling.
Right. You're right. They can use, in the case of rentals, they can use that rental stream. In the case of condominiums, once they sell those units, they can turn right around then and invest in the next project. And that's what small local scale developers need to do and do. So I think that's another kind of undertold success story of this.
Although it's the big flagship projects like Interstate Avenue that make the headlines, it's actually the more subtle projects that are contributing most to easing Portland's housing pressure. In 2020, Portland launched the Residential Infill Project, effectively abolishing single-family detached zoning and allowing 4 to 6 homes on these lots, the largest U.S. city to do so far. Since then, the outright majority of new builds in Portland's single-dwelling zoned neighborhoods have been multifamily. This is what that can look like. In 2022, this was 1 house. Now it's 4. When people think of upzoning, they think about Vancouver and say, I don't want a skyscraper being built next to my house. That will ruin everything. That's not in the character of this neighborhood at all. This kind of subtle, gentle densification, an ADU here, a quadruplex there, some infill over there, this is really what's making the difference here in Portland. Not only do projects like this increase density, but most of the time they actually preserve or even enhance the neighborhood's character. These big national housing developers don't like doing projects like this. For them, this isn't where the money is. They have the tools and the infrastructure for these massive copy-paste suburbs that look like anywhere else in the nation. But it's the little projects like this that allow for the smaller local developers who care about Portland's aesthetic and culture to compete and deliver something which the community will appreciate. This isn't Charlotte or Arlington. It couldn't be. Whether you like it or not, you have to admit, this is Portland. The communal craft and cooking area straight out of the conquest of bread. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but it speaks to the character of this place and the people who built it. Something that sprawl almost always fails to achieve. This kind of gentle densification could occur in almost any city where the pressure for housing is high enough. We just have to make the commitment and change the zoning laws to allow for it.
There is room to accommodate all of our projected growth without expanding.
Yeah, I've looked at the numbers since they passed the residential infill project,
Mhm.
and the majority of new units in single-family zoned areas have been multifamily, which sounds like kind of funny, but it's true. And that's actually what's making the biggest difference, more than any of these like big expansions. It's these
Yep.
little ADUs and cottage clusters going in.
Yeah. Yeah, and we paid a lot of attention to that during my tenure in Portland and they've upped the game since. And that's a very kind of quiet infill that's going on without the big pop from a major area or major corridor. But they're very significant numbers, and those tend to grow on their own and over time. And we witnessed that in most cities in North America that have introduced those kinds of policies.
What about this? How much regional character does this place have? It's a development that has been going up in the farmland south of Gresham. It's by some of the same national developers that you see everywhere: Lennar, Taylor Morrison, and D.R. Horton. They use the same formula that they apply in Salem and across the nation. They take a greenfield and lay down row after row of detached homes. When I was born, this was a farm, but by then, the developers had already been given the green light. Most of the land for this development was annexed into Portland's urban growth boundary in 2002, the largest expansion to date. The city had let the pressure for housing build so much that here it spilled over. It was strategic though. The idea was to ease that pressure for 20 years, allowing Portland to address some of its issues downtown and prepare more core urban land for redevelopment. 23 years later, and Portland once again has a housing crisis, one of the worst in the entire nation. The city has done a lot to promote infill and redevelopment, giving out all kinds of incentives and grants to developers, relaxing design requirements, and in the wake of COVID, encouraging office to residential conversions. Clearly, despite all of this infill and redevelopment that has taken place, Portland isn't keeping pace with the demand for housing. If you've been paying attention to American urban planning in 2025, you'll have seen this article in the New York Times: Why America Should Sprawl by Connor Doherty. The article praises the Texan model of sprawl and makes a simple argument that you can afford to buy a house in Texas. You can't say that about California, Oregon, or Washington, right? Infill and redevelopment is slow and complicated. It gets bogged down with all these constraints and lawsuits. It's not enough. This revival of that 50s, 60s approach towards growth is all the rage right now. The newest policy from DC is all about the expansion of single-family detached housing. But the question remains, do these sprawling developments pencil out in the long run?
I feel like the most revolutionary thing we could do with housing is make money on it, but like not that much. It's like people right now are either like, build everything, it will filter, let the market do its job, or they're like, socialism, social housing dream, whatever. And I feel like the answer is actually just like, build housing, make some money, but like not that much.
$5,200 per home, about $30,000 in revenue per acre without accounting for expenses. More math: 299.13 lane miles of roadway Gresham is in charge of which about 3.1 or 6.2 lane miles are in the built-out area here between 39th and 43rd. Gresham spent $46.8 million on transport in the fiscal year 23-24. Let's assume 2.07 of that was spent here. That's a total of $968,760, or $12,792 per acre. That already cuts our revenue nearly in half, and that's only one of 10 categories of expense that Gresham has related to maintenance. Right now, this development is probably still making money, but as it ages and actually starts needing maintenance, it may join those Cold War era suburbs which actively lose money for cities.
Yeah, I think really that article is somewhat misguided or misstated. And, you know, every region is a bit different in terms of their planning legacy. But we have, I think, more than enough space around the state inside current urban growth boundaries to accommodate the development inside without sprawling further. The state says we need over about 550,000 new units, many of them smaller than traditional, to accommodate the next 20 years of growth in Oregon, and about half of those in the metro area. So a good chunk of that metro chunk would occur within the city of Portland, but also the surrounding suburbs. And we have so much land that is already upzoned, and some of it could easily be zoned under local comprehensive plans, including Portland's, that I think we can accommodate nearly all of that growth without sprawl. And I think the costs of infrastructure, which have often been ignored in the past when you do sprawl, are suddenly coming home to roost. And so here, infrastructure was all in place, including the investment in the light rail in this particular case. But that's not the case in every neighborhood district in Portland, where I've also upzoned successfully and stimulated housing. So I think if you just look at the true on paper capacity inside of cities or metro areas, that there is room to accommodate all of our projected growth without expanding.
Obviously, nobody is arguing for this kind of development on its aesthetic or place-making merits. Rather, it's guys like Connor who see this as a pragmatic solution to the absolutely real problem that infill and redevelopment isn't occurring fast enough to address demand.
I guess I just really wanted to try to make the case that greenfield has to be part of the solution. And, you know, I don't want to get super prescriptive design wise about what that is, because then I'm off in the realm of architecture critics and stuff like that, which is totally value. It's just not where my value lies. And I was just trying to make essentially a mathematical argument, which is it's very hard to imagine us solving this problem, certainly in any kind of like time frame that could make anyone around right now's life better, like without that being a big piece of it.
These guys acknowledge that sprawl has caused us a lot of financial hardship. But they say, hey, if the residential infill project is going so well, then in 30 years, after this Trump-era sprawl has become a financial burden, this wave of infill will have reached them, and we'll have the necessary pressure to upzone this stuff while we build the next generation of sprawl even further out. It's really not a ridiculous concept, but it is a massive risk. It's essentially a Ponzi scheme that relies on a constant, predictable demand for new homes, which is a problem if you know anything about the housing market, because you know it's unpredictable. Even if you make the ridiculous assumption that everyone at some point will want to buy a detached home, then you only need to glance at our record low fertility rate to see that in 30 years, housing trends are going to be entirely different. And no, we can't rely on consistent waves of new Californians moving in either. By building these unsustainable one or two generation non-places, we're signing ourselves up for one of two futures. Either we keep insatiably sprawling outward and are eventually forced to make huge capital improvements to upzone these places and make them profitable, or, more likely, eventually we let these non-places fall into ruin because we can't afford to pay for their bills. Are infill and redevelopment currently enough to meet our housing needs? No, but I have absolute confidence that within a decade they will be. Portland is just ramping up, and as more of these local developers complete projects, their resources and experience will grow, and before long, they'll be outcompeting these national developers. And one of the great things about that kind of development is that it's sustainable. If demand for new housing dries up for unforeseen reasons, that's okay, because the housing we build pays for itself. Keep Portland, Oregon, not Texas. At Thousand Friends, people often mischaracterize our mission as being about protecting noble Oregonian farmers from these ravenous, destructive cities that encroach on their lands. And sometimes that is how it plays out, but that's not really what we consider our mission to be. We're all about making cities more urban and farms more productive. That means more intense use of urban land, which then in turn allows for more intense use of our rural lands. And all this allows for us to conserve more of what makes Oregon truly great, our wilderness, as you can see around me. If you'd like to support our cause, visit friends.org, and if you'd like to know more about the information presented in this video, you can see all the sources in the description. Thank you.